the Countryside Podcasts with Chris Skinner.
Just come in through a rather venerable looking gate into the churchyard at Caistor St Edmund, which is the local parish church of, you guessed it, Norfolk farmer and nature lover Chris Skinner. Here's another podcast. Hello, Chris.
Morning, Matthew. The places I take you to, honestly. Yes, the parish church here at Caistor, lots and lots of history. Don't think it's a sort of sad place, or macabre, what we're going to talk about this morning, but there are gravestones all around us, and I know so many of the former workers at High Ash Farm and my parents and grandparents, and Rat is very obedient, he just squealed, he's on a lead here, and I can see one of the farm workers' wage gravestone there, James Swinger, and he worked for my father for close on 50 years. So, absolutely amazing.
Died November 23rd, 1959.
Yes, I know. Just the years fly past. It's a lovely old church built of flint and rubble, and various additions to it over the centuries. There's parts of it are Norman, from the Norman conquest, sort of 1066, way back then. Parts of it we think are Saxon as well. There's some buildings here, and when an extra bit to the church was added a few years ago, some skeletons were found, so it was a site of some importance, and it's right on the edge of the Roman town itself, which was all part of the Caistor Hall estate, part of High Ash Farm. And I've got a wonderful photograph of my father at 15 years old, just at the other side of these oak trees here, and he was ploughing with 3 horses, and his 16th birthday was spent sailing out to New Zealand, where he spent the next 15 years. So it's a lovely picture of his childhood and just how hard it was way back then. The plane flying right over the top of us at the moment. But we're just going to walk down because it's quite a really sort of emotive spot, really. It's where you spend the last sort of residue of your life. That gravestone in front is for Harry Holden, and I'd just taken him a turkey for his Christmas present, and he'd just finished that. And on the 1st of January 1988 he died, and I think I've spent more time with Harry than at that time of my life than with anybody else. He was very short, stout, incredibly strong as well as a farm worker, and his nickname was Happy. He didn't really have any possessions. He lived in one of the farm cottages close to the church here, and such a lovely memory, and he taught me so much about the ways of the countryside and how to set traps for rats and things like that, all the things that interested a very young lad back at that time.
And he'd been born in 1909.
Yes.
I mean, that generation, of course, are gone now. That's
Yes.
my grandparents' generation, your parents' generation.
Yes, all gone, and obviously it was difficult times because we're just walking on a little bit further. We're very close to the entrance door of the church now. My daughter got married here, Kate, and here we go. Here's the next one along, and it's for Herbert Skinner, my grandfather, but his wife died first, Rosemary Skinner, and Herbert John, HJ as he was known, farmed at Marksall. He was born at Bungay, but moved to Marksall in about 1900 and farmed there almost until he retired. And he in his latter years, after my granny had died, one of their daughters, they had 3 sons and 5 daughters, and one of the sons was obviously my father, and Emily looked after Herbert in his latter years. She never actually got married, but she's just tucked in at the bottom of the tombstone there. And Herbert HJ was a fantastic old boy, full of tricks, huge sense of humour. And he was born, I think, in about 1887 and died. He got to quite a good age, died at 87 years old. And why I'm here is all of these relations. My parents are just beside Harry Holden there, just a little few steps back. Sam Skinner, my father. It's almost to come and almost communicate through my head with them to say I'm cultivating now, but not cultivating the soil as all my relations and all these farm workers. I'm trying to kind of cultivate an interest and a love in nature, because that seems to be lacking in our modern society. So that's the difference. So, and of course it is the Norfolk motto, do different. So, and that's what I try to do.
Maybe when these people were younger, it was second nature to most people about knowing the countryside ways, and now there's been a great separation, hasn't there?
And not only that, but families all separate up now. I have one son down in the southern counties. My daughter's fairly close, and Daniel, my son, does help and work on the farm full time, and that would have been the way back. But these people were soil tillers. It was incredibly hard work. Remember, horsepower back then was horsepower. As I said, just on the outskirts of the churchyard here, my father, that wonderful picture of 3 working horses and a 2-furrow plough, and this 15-year-old boy, obviously ploughing quite a large 25-acre field inside the Roman town. So it's a huge change. There was no telephone, no electricity, no cars back then. That change that we're used to, that's every day for us, is monumental. And so the thing that's missing perhaps isn't so much the food and the food production, which I'm trained to do and itching to do, but it's our care of nature, and we'll be exploring that later on in the podcast this morning. But if we just walk back a few steps, just along here, so a lot of history here, lots of celebrations, marriages and funerals, but they really all demonstrate the full life that many people had. So here we are, right next to Harry Holden, in ever-loving memory of my father, Samuel David Skinner, 5th of April 1909, and he died on my daughter's first birthday, 29th of July 1980, right next to where I was standing. He just went like a pack of cards. What a wonderful, it's hugely upsetting, so don't think I've become blasé about passing on, but he just sort of went out as though somebody flicked a light switch off, and it was such a wonderful way to pass away. And the same happened to my mum. They were both hard-working people. She was Mary Phyllis Overton, and of course Overton's come down the family name as a great friend and a close relation as well of Horatio Nelson in my family tree there, which is in the car. I
wondered why you were wearing the eye patch this morning.
Yeah, thank you, yes. Oh dear. But lovely history, so not at all macabre, and I come and smile, and these people all completed their lives. Many of them did get past the 70 years and 10, which is 70 years, and that's used to be the normal life expectancy. But I have tilled the fields for a full 55 years, would you believe? And now I'm cultivating a different interest in the countryside. Not food, but the love and knowledge of nature. Come on, I think that's enough philosophy for this morning. But there's some huge trees at the entrance to the church there, and 2 of them were planted by church wardens at Caistor St Edmund Church, one of which was Jack Stockings, who's buried quite close to us, and the other one was Samuel Skinner. On coronation year, 1953, there's a redwood tree, and I noticed all the way down the trunk there's little white bird droppings, and it's a special tree for roosting tree creepers. In little pockets in there, you can punch the tree with your fist and the bark is soft, and it's right at the entrance. So we better shut the gate, head off back to our next podcast spot. But there's one thing missing. Here he comes, you good boy. Come on, in the car. He's been in a bramble patch, would you believe?
Rat is off the lead and he's bounding around like an extra from a Lassie film.
You're telling me? Yes, I did get into films once. I played the lead in Lassie.
Ouch.
Sorry, he's skirting along there. We're on one of the large fields at High Ash Farm, and it's close on 40 hectares in total. Stretches way away into the distance, all one field, and it's now my pride and joy because it's a pollen and nectar field. And in previous podcasts, quite recently, we've been looking at some of the things out in the countryside that you can't see. Basically, they're not there. When you look across a field, things like the worms, the moles that are under the ground, and some of the plants as well, which also have underground stores over the winter months, things like the bluebells and the snowdrops, and they're all now starting to put in an appearance. But there's a plant growing here all around our feet. There's an area of particular soil on this field which goes diagonally across this hillside, Matthew. You can actually see there's a slight difference in the greenness on the side of this hill. It's almost bare ground and there's quite a lot of moss here. And it's pure clay. It's got a special name because it's got chalk in it. It's called marl. So it's very, very high pH soil, lots of lime in it, in other words. And what's happened is over the centuries it's been ploughed and the soil has worked its way off the top of these hills down into the valley. So the valley behind us is sort of verdant green and much more fertile. But I've got kind of lots more questions than answers in my head, because there's last year plants growing here which had hardly been seen before at the farm, and I cut a little walkway in. You can see the dark green line in where I made a footpath in. We're standing right next to Boudica Way, one of the main footpaths that goes through from Norwich down to Diss, and it's right beside where we're standing, and I'm going to do the same again this year. But I've got a mystery, because there were bee orchids here last year for people to walk and come and see, and there's probably getting on 800, 1,000 of them, and they were all really on this clay outcrop with all the chalk in it. And bee orchids are, you could say they're bee orchids as a swear word, because they tend to be there 1 year and then disappear for 4 or 5 years, or even longer. They're sort of there 1 minute and gone the next. And what's happened is something quite extraordinary, which I don't know the answer to, but orchid seed is incredibly light. It can blow off in the wind. It doesn't have its own food reserve with it. It has a special relationship. When it gets back on the soil, a fungus will surround the so-called seed, and it's there and it's growing under the soil as a seed and will eventually form a tuber. But the tuber doesn't produce any leaves, and wait for it, nobody knows how long that relationship is under the soil before the orchid actually throws up leaves and come into flower. So I thought I would call an orchid expert, and I happen to know one. His name is Andrew Wallace Bannister, and he used to live in Norwich, and he was growing orchids from seed way back in his childhood, and he became obsessed with them. He now runs a business in Lincolnshire, in Grantham, selling orchids and growing them. And I had a chat with him about what's happened under our feet, because if you look down, you can see some rather unusual plants. If I go down my hands and knees and just put my ruler on the ground, I've brought a 12-inch school ruler. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 20, more or less, in a little bit more than a square foot. And the further we go up the hill, the denser and denser they are. I've put a little marker in.
And these are orchids?
These are bee orchids. And they've not been here before. So obviously this has been a pollen and nectar field for 20 years now. So how long have those orchids been developing under the soil in this sort of fungal relationship? It's called a mycorrhizal relationship, where a fungus actually surrounds the orchid seed, and it's a kind of communal relationship, if you like, a commensal relationship. One feeds the other, and it's really odd. So have worms brought the orchid seed up from way down? Remember, we looked at worms and we discovered that they go down in the soil, perhaps sometimes more than a metre deep, the little earth burrows, and they bring soil up and take organic matter back down. So are these orchids from centuries and centuries ago? Because some seed in the soil becomes dormant and doesn't grow. I'm thinking particularly of poppies. And at Rothamsted Plant Research Station, I know for a fact because I visited it when I was at college. We went there and there were some seed files there that they keep, and they had poppy seed there, which at that time was 120 years old, and it was still 90% viable. And you remember First World War with the trenches, when you had all the soil brought up from underneath in Flanders. The fields were red, and it's still the symbol of, obviously, Remembrance Sunday. And so some seeds last a long time. So the question is, how did the orchids get here, and why are there so many? What's special about it this year? If we walk up the
I think
hill,
it's a rather wonderful idea that they came from way below, and
Yes.
of course for centuries this has been under the
Oh,
plough and food
yes, it
production,
has.
and in the last 20 years it hasn't.
it's fantastic wheat soil, so there's an element of guilt. But just look here, all over I've sort of put little stakes in, so I know where I can safely mow. So if I put my foot rule, and I will ring my poor long-suffering photographer up yet again. Laura, will you come and photograph my orchids, please? Because here's the ruler on the ground, and you can see a rat's just arrived, very excited. You can see there's 20 just in the length beside the ruler there. So bee orchids, anybody who studies botany, the first time you see a bee orchid, I can understand what causes a huge excitement. They are so exotic.
But when you devised this field and the plan for it all those years ago, you had absolutely no idea that this would happen.
No. I think in the mix I put here, there were about 20 species of British native wildflowers, things like oxeye daisy, red clover, sandfoin, yarrow I can see right beside us. Here's yarrow, Achilles milfolium, the plant with 1,000 leaves, if you like. All the British native flowers that would, and when you do that, only half of them will thrive. The other half just sort of fade away. They don't like where they are, but they'll grow happily elsewhere, and that's so. There are about 25,000 species of orchid in the UK, and we have in the world, I should say, so don't get too excited.
But still, that's a lot, isn't it?
25,000 in the world. Some of them grow on rocks, some of them up in trees. But in the UK, we have 49 species, and some of those are incredibly rare now. There's one called Lady's Slipper, which only grows in one area, and it's heavily protected. But nevertheless, whichever orchid species you have, they're incredible. The bee orchid looks as though it's imitating its name, if you like, a bee, to kind of sort of encourage a bee to mate with the flower, if you like. Actually, the body is almost furry and on the flower head itself, and I'll bring you back here in June, I promise, and we'll be able to enjoy all of these in flower, because these are big enough to flower. They're not sort of 1-year-old orchids come up above the ground. They've got leaves on which are sort of 75 mil across. That one's about 3 inches across. So they're very, very common here, but there's something exotic about them. Orchis comes from the Latin of testicle, because of most of the species have what's called a double ovoid tuber at the bottom of them, and they grow from that. But really fascinating plants to know. They can be underground growing with this relationship with soil fungi for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, even before anything comes up above the ground. Yet another one of those fascinating things out in the countryside that we don't know the answer to. And Andrew couldn't actually say. He grows them orchid from seed in a special solution which he has, and he usually can get them to flower in the first, about after 5 years. But out in the wild, nobody knows exactly how long it takes between seed and the first flower from this particular species, the bee orchid.
We'll come back later in the year to see them at their very best.
Yes, I promise we'll do that, as long as we're both fit and healthy and well. But just look at that, what a sight. The ground's absolutely peppered with them all over. Everywhere you look, there's orchids coming up out of the ground. What a surprise. Landed on the ground.
My word, Chris, look.
Oh, no, I didn't see
So
that
close.
one. I didn't see that one. I'll get the binoculars.
So we've got some of our winter visitors, Chris.
Matthew, we were then on our way to record our last piece. And we have birds coming out of the trees on our right and landing on the field on our left. Last week, we bid farewell to the field fairs, and I did say to you at the time they were really itchy and irritated, and they had a fantastic southwesterly wind, and the whole lot have gone back across to the near continent, and they've left their smaller relatives here. And so we're sitting on Caistor Park, a rookery down at the end of the field in front of us, we'll visit in a minute, and the redwing at this end of the field on the pasture, just hopping along, stopping, listening, flicking leaves over. They're quite close to some beech trees, but there's well over 100, and they're scattered all over the hillside to our left, almost behind the car. You can see quite a number there. So,
We got very close just now as we came in, and the pattern close to of the bird's plumage and the colour is remarkable.
See if I can focus a pair of binoculars for you. There we are. I will just hold the microphone, and if you get it focused in, choose one that's fairly close to us. There's one just in front of the car. You should see that it doesn't look like a song thrush. It's a similar size to our native song thrush, but it's got that orange russet flash where the wing joins the body, and if that particular bird took off, it's obviously called redwing, Turdus iliacus, one of the thrush species. It would be almost bright red under the wing. I daren't start the car to move it forwards. But
russet is very clear.
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, there's one, Matthew, just come through. It's just close to the electric fence stake. It's been very obliging. It's just over near this beech tree where I'm pointing. I don't, because they're quite well. It's just hopped. Here it is. Yes. Now you should get that one. That's less than 20 yards away, and when it's sideways on, and remember, small birds sort of stripe through the eye, and that very obvious orange flash.
Speckled pattern.
Look, and there's one come right beside us now, 10 yards away. We're so spoilt. As I said, at High Ash Farm, the birds come towards you. They don't fly away. But they're going to be heading off any time now back across the North Sea. And that's a lovely introduction to our final bit. And more birds coming out of the trees, flying over the top of the car and landing all around us. And they're feasting up, ready for their migration back again across the North Sea and then up quite a way up into northern Europe. So really spoilt to see that.
I can hear a woodpecker.
Yes, that's quite likely. This is good territory for them. Yes, I think you did.
That very rhythmic sound.
Oh, wow.
God, yes. Very loud.
Let me open this window. It's on my right-hand side.
Let's just hear if we can... There's 3 species of woodpecker, isn't there?
Yes. Great spot, which I think that one was. There it goes again.
It's like a rattle.
So the lesser spot, which we have at the farm as well, Dendrocropus minor, and the green woodpecker, which is the largest of the three species. Redwing right in front of the car now. Oh, some goldfinches just flying out to join the redwing.
The ducks at High Ash Farm going in to roost for an evening. Hey everyone, it's Matthew here, and if you've been enjoying our countryside podcasts, we've got a small favour to ask.
Yes, Matthew. What we're going to do is to ask for a small donation to help run the podcast, and any surplus goes for conservation at High Ash Farm here. And so it's really important. We'd both love to keep the podcast going, and that duck agrees with me, I think.
Well, it's straightforward to donate. You can make a one-off donation or set up a small monthly contribution, and the address is highashfarm.com/podcast.
We're hugely grateful for any support. It means we can keep sharing the stories of the countryside, which I love doing each week, but it's that small amount of costs we need to cover. So thank you very much in advance.
So, what do you? I mean, is it difficult to tell them apart?
Yes, it is a little bit difficult. The great spot tends to drum, just as you heard, lasting about 1 or 2 seconds. Very fast. It's not drilling for insects or grubs. It's actually sounding out its territory by drumming. And when you have two male woodpeckers in a particular area of woodland, it's great fun. They kind of aren't, they're challenging each other, if you like, by the intensity, the loudness of the drumming. So they'll go right to the top of an old dead hardwood tree where it's as hard as nails, and they have a special cushion at the back of their head which sort of helps prevent them getting a headache. And they'll drum away. The green woodpecker will also drum, but much, much less frequently. I have recorded a green woodpecker drumming. And the lesser spot, which is about as rare as hen's teeth, we also have at the farm. We've got 2 pairs. We had a pair nesting very close to where we're sitting last year. I took you to the nest. It's the nest hole is not much bigger than your index finger to go in. It is a diminutive little woodpecker, also called the barred woodpecker. And it does drum, but it's often a higher frequency of drumming and sometimes longer than the great spot. But you're just being spoilt. This field is now awash with redwing. I can't believe it.
Maybe we should look at the rooks next week, because we're now well into March, aren't we? We will be next week.
Yes.
We're just into March this week, but in the meantime we've had a little unexpected detour to see these winter visiting redwing.
Well, it was unintentional. They've put themselves there. We've got this kind of nomadic flock going round the farm. Sometimes they're in the woodland if I drive past, and this morning, just by chance, they're right in front of us on the pasture. You could not be closer than what we are now. That is pure luck, pure magic. The countryside in spring.
Always great to receive your emails, questions and comments. And we've got one here. They describe themselves as your number 1 loyal listeners. It's Ian and Marilyn, the Robertsons. And it's a lovely note here, but I'll just cut straight to the question. They say, in the summer, back in June, I took a photo of something that I spotted on a pathway at the Norfolk Wildlife Trust Reserve at Upton Broad. We're not very good with tech, but have managed to make it electronic, and it should be attached. And indeed it is. Could you please tell us what this creature was? We know summer was a long time ago, but we'd be very grateful.
Yes, it's a really interesting moth caterpillar. Unfortunately, it's quite a common species, and in my youth I used to just call them all woolly bears because it's very, very hairy, but it's really distinct, and so that enabled me to identify it for you. It lives on low vegetation. It eats quite quite a number of different wildflowers. It can be its food plant, and it's called the garden tiger moth, Arctica cadger. So, as I said, a woolly bear. And so you've photographed it at exactly the right time, because the adult moth flies in June and July and just into August. That's its main time. And so well done, because it's such a striking caterpillar. The only way to describe it is a cigarette butt covered in long black hairs with sort of almost crimson, or if not dark orange hairs around the head end of it, and that enabled me to identify it accurately. So well done, you've got a garden tiger.
Hello to Ian Yockney, who lives in North Norfolk, and Ian says, we watch bird activity from our kitchen window. Last week a robin came to the bird table and took a beak full of food and flew away with it. He came back about 5 times in all, never eating any himself. Surely it's too early for the robin to have a nest worth of young. What else may he be doing with the food that he's taken away?
Well, yes, interesting. He's not caching it, because some birds will do that. The nut hatchers at the farm are continually emptying my nut feeders. But what he's doing, he is his lady. He will have paired up. She is probably incubating, because robins are members of the thrush family. We just saw those redwing. They're all early nesters, as are blackbirds and song thrushes too. And she's incubating the eggs. So initially it was courtship feeding, which he would have been doing in August, September, October, when robins start to get together and pair up and also start singing. And now she's incubating the eggs in a little cup-shaped nest somewhere. She's kind of dependent, sort of staying at the nest all day almost, until she just has a cleansing flight. But he's feeding her, so he's taking the food away and looking after his wife on the nest of eggs. Wonderful.
Here's one from the United States, from Glenview, Illinois. It's Andy Olcott, who says, you mentioned how deer thrive on the farm. How does the population stay in check? I think the only apex predator left in England is the badger, which you also have, but do they take down deer?
Well, badgers wouldn't take down deer, but the deer population is controlled in certain parts of the country, particularly up in Scotland, where you have the red deer, and they're controlled by stalking to prevent the herds doing too much damage to forestry, or numbers just getting too large. Here in the eastern counties, quite a number are still shot, so man's kind of the apex predator, if you like, but there's another killer out in the countryside, particularly in the east of England. Deer populations getting quite large, roe deer, particularly the introduced species like muntjac, Chinese water deer, and that's the car. Road casualties are colossal, and cars are going through in sort of new areas where you have new roads built where the deer haven't encountered them before, and particularly each year after the young are born and they're set away from the parents, they have to find their own territory. They're inexperienced, and many of those end up as road casualties as well. But sometimes with fawns, with people walking in the countryside with dogs off leads, the dog will bite a young fawn deer. It's sort of laying in its little lair, undisturbed, and only gets visited by the mum to nurse it. And if the dog visits, or a dog scent is left on the deer, the mother, the doe deer, will desert the young and it will perish. So there's still, if you like, predators of different forms out in the countryside, but here we don't control them, and I have some wonderful views of all the different deer species that inhabit this farm.
Well, Andy, in his note here, talks about white-tailed deer in the nearby forest preserves. Andy actually lives in a suburb of Chicago, so it's great to bring a bit of the countryside to you from our own country, all the way thousands of miles over to the States. Andy, thank you for the email. And Caroline, who lives in London, but has a cousin, Anne, who lives in or just near Beccles, which isn't far from here. And she says, Are snowdrops actually a native plant? That's a good question, isn't it? Because we've just seen so many snowdrops at the side of the road leading into this field.
We have, and the jury is out on that one. The first records in the UK, I think, was in 1597, and later on, I think it was Thomas, I'm just trying to think of his name, Thomas Tickwell. He called it vegetable snow because parts of the countryside were absolutely peppered with it, and it looked like the ground was covered in snow. And that was in the wild in the early 1700s. Around in this part of East Anglia, we have some amazing displays. There's somewhere just on the Suffolk coast, which I try and visit once a year. It's at Dunwich, around the old priory there, close to Dunwich Heath, and there are tens of thousands of snowdrops there. And the other one is at Walsingham Priory here in Norfolk, and there seems to be a link with monasteries and snowdrops, because I think the nuns used to plant the snowdrops as a kind of the flower was known as purity in itself, pure white, and so many of them got spread out and about. So we don't actually know if it's a native species. Certainly there are native colonies really close to the UK in Normandy and northern France, just a short hop across the channel at that point. So the jury's really still out, and nobody can prove it because it goes back so far in our history. So we really don't know if it's a native species or not.
Well, lovely to hear Walsingham mentioned. Since medieval times, it's been a site of pilgrimage and still going to this day. And Dunwich, of course, was a major city in medieval times that's now out to sea.
Yes, and there's only parts of it left. And I think the priory there is called Greyfriars from memory.
Like Greyfriars Bobby. You've got Greyfriars Bobby on your lap.
Yes, I have. Look at here. Yes, perfect. He's behaving very well at the moment.
Well, Caroline says, rat isn't demented. He's just a terrier.
Exactly that. I couldn't have put it better myself, but when you see him running round on a field in the afternoon, pure delight. He is totally demented, I can promise you.
Emails to chris@highashfarm.com, and just a quick word to say thank you to all the people who've contributed to the running costs of this podcast, and indeed the money does go to the conservation projects that Chris runs on the farm as well. And if you want to find out more, just go to www.highashfarm.com/podcast.
Yes, and a huge thank you for me as well. It's always a huge delight. We never quite know what we're going to see or hear, but it's always great fun to share the countryside with you.
It's a date for next week then.
Oh, yes.